So just move on to the proper. Yeah, so hello everyone. Welcome to the third webinar organized by the Workers' Party Youth Wing on COVID-19. Our previous sessions were well received and we thank everyone for your feedback and response. In this third episode, our panelists will discuss their hopes and vision for post-COVID Singapore, a conversation across generations, reimagining our future together. So you'll see that, we have our panelists will comprise of people from across various age groups. And also, moving on, please post your questions on Zoom using the Q&A function or on Facebook using the comments once the live stream is up. We will try to take as many of your questions as possible, but since time is limited, we can only engage on points about the post-COVID theme. Although Zoom allows two-way video and audio, we will be leaving all audience members' cameras and mics switched off, both for your privacy and to avoid unwanted interruptions. You'll not be able to turn the cameras and mics on. If you have any questions for the panelists, please use Zoom's Q&A function. You'll find the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window, and you may click it and then type your question in the Q&A window. The entire session is being recorded and will be available on our Facebook page for you to catch up on your Facebook on your own base. Before we move on to the introduction proper, allow me to present findings from a survey from the Youth Wing, which we conducted a few days ago. So what we sent to everyone as a premise for the survey was with a backdrop of COVID-induced new norms and looming general elections, it is perhaps timely for Singaporeans to reimagine the Singapore we want to build. So what are some policy directions we need to re-examine, or sacred cows that need slaughtering? So what are those practices we need to keep and build on? So I'll show the survey results. So can everyone see the slides? Okay, so this is the survey that we've conducted. So the questions we asked were, what areas do you think Singapore does best at? We have to rank the top 3. What areas do you think Singapore could do better in? Ranking the top 3. And what are your hopes for Singapore's future? So for the first 2 questions, the options given were civil liberties, cost of living, education system, environment, government accountability, healthcare, housing, inequality, and jobs and wages. So a total of 728 respondents over the past over 4 days in the past week. So just 99% of respondents were Singapore citizens, and if you can note that a majority of the respondents were above 40. Yeah. So we assign points to each policy category based on people's rankings. So for example, first choice, we have 3 points, waste 3 points, second choice waste 2 points, and third choice waste 1 point. For each category, the rank points were summed up and expressed as a percentage of the total number of points in the survey. So you can see based on the overall quantitative results, what areas do you think, for the first question, what areas do you think that Singapore does best at? So the top 3 were the education system, healthcare, and environment. And what areas do you think Singapore can do better in? Ranked by relative importance, top 3 were cost of living, civil liberties and freedoms, and government accountability. So in terms of age-wise quantitative results, as you can see, based on the age groups, yeah, they are pretty spread. It really depends. Like for example, if you see some of these sentiments may be shared across the different age groups, especially when it comes to what areas do you think Singapore could do better in when it comes to government accountability, for example. The the ranking, the relative importance was pretty much almost the same across the three age groups. And we actually sent actually question number 3, right? It was actually an open-ended question. So we actually prepared a word cloud based on the multiple open-ended responses we have received on what are hopes for Singapore's future. So it comes many of the words, many of the more popular words include hope, transparency, accountability, which are pretty much some of them at least are in line with the more popular options that were mentioned earlier. So I'll move on to the actual introduction proper. So I'll pass the time to Dennis to move on with introducing the panelists we have today. And then we'll move on with the Q&A sessions as well. Yeah. Hi, Dennis.
Hi everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to our Workers' Party Youth Wing webinar on reimagining a post-COVID Singapore. Hope you all have a good day so far. I thank everyone for signing up to our webinar. We have close to 500 people on our webinar today, and many other people are following on Facebook Live on our WP Youth Wing and WP Facebook pages. The webinar today builds on our previous webinars relating to COVID-19 and effects in Singapore. And today we have a very exciting lineup of distinguished panelists, and each of them Singaporeans from very different background, age group and experience. Today the panelists will be discussing their hopes and vision for post-COVID Singapore. Before I introduce our 5 panelists, let me say that our panelists are here today in their own personal capacity, and the views they will share with us today are their own personal views and are not representative of their employers or any organizations they may belong to, and their appearance here does not constitute support for any partisan political position or organization. Now let me introduce our distinguished panelists. First we have Sunny Liu. Sunny is a cartoonist whose pretty well-known book, The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chai, won 3 Eisner Awards and was the first graphic novel to receive the Singapore Literature Prize. He has worked on other titles for publishers like DC Comics, Marvel Comics, and First Second Books. Next, we have a very distinguished member of our arts community, Mr. T. Sasitharan. Sasi is co-founder and director of the Intercultural Theatre Institute. With the late Kopal Kun, he conceived and started ITI in 2000. He was artistic director of Substation between 1995 to 2000, Singapore's only independent arts centre, and also theatre and visual arts critique of the Straits Times between 1988 and 1995. For 40 years now, he has worked as an actor, performer, director, and producer. He writes and lectures on art theatre, training, performance practice, and Singapore culture. And many of us know that Sasi received the Cultural Medallion in 2012. Next, we have Ms. Qi Yun Wu. Qi Yun is a recent environmental studies graduate and an environmental activist who takes to social media to make climate information and policy accessible to her audience. As a Singaporean youth, she believes that climate action is overdue and urgent action for a green and just transition of society needs to happen now. Then we have Mr. Damien Chung. Damien is our young civil society advocate who started his own civil society journey back in 2010 when he was in 2nd year at Serangoon Junior College. He is now a law graduate and he hopes to be called to the bar later this year. And finally, we also have Mr. P.N. Bauji. a household name in Singapore journalism for the last 40 years. He has worked in 5 newspapers, 3 of which he edited. He also writes regularly for SCMP and Yahoo. And last year, he wrote the book Reluctant Editor. And some of us grew up reading his papers over decades. Let me just give a run through of the program today. Now, we will start by having the panelists share their views with us for about 5 minutes per person. And after that, the panelists are free to ask each other questions about the issue which have been brought up by the other panelists. We'll then, in a way, open the floor to our audience. Now we'll take questions from the floor. So for those who are with us on the webinar, please submit your questions to the Q&A, and our team will be collating these questions and the panelists. Okay, without further ado, let me invite our first speaker, our first panelist, Sunny, to speak.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Yeah, clear? Okay. So I think this pandemic experience has felt unprecedented in many ways. Like I personally never thought I would see the Causeway close or have a Olympic postponed. But it's happened, right? And I think because of the way it feels, I think a lot of us believe that somehow our lives will change in some fundamental way because things can't be the same as they were before the pandemic. But the problem is that there are many views out there about what can change or what should change. And for example, like with the migrant status, migrant workers in Singapore, some people I think would love to go back to the status quo. Some people believe that changes in the way that dorms are built would be enough, and other people believe that we need really deep systematic changes. And I think these things can't all happen at the same time, right? And so there's going to be conflict, I think, and contestation of ideas post-pandemic, right? And for me today, rather than talk about what I personally think should or could happen, I have to think a bit about maybe a way to think about our own views that could make it easier to find common ground, maybe, or at least be a little bit less angry at people who disagree with us. And the central idea here is about storytelling, right? And how essentially we are all storytellers, and that everything we believe in at some level are just narratives, and that maybe we should therefore not be too attached to a particular story just because they're the ones that we ourselves believe in. And what I mean by stories is quite a broad thing, right? It's they include belief systems and models of reality that allow us to make sense of the world. And when we share them and believe in them together as communities, then we are able to build what is sometimes called intersubjective realities that are quite powerful. The historian Yuval Harari talks about it quite a lot, right? He likes to give the example of chimpanzees and how you can never get a chimpanzee to do something for a banana in the afterlife, or to give you a banana in exchange for pieces of paper that have no real value. And yet, for us humans, we are very willing to do these things, right? We do things for religion, we do things for money, and is this ability to believe in things that don't exist that allows us to build, nuclear bombs and big mega cities, and our collective belief in things like money, religions, nation states, and corporations, things that don't exist in a real non-human world, but through our collective belief and imagination, become very real and very tangible things. And at the same time, of course, when we're telling stories about ourselves and the world, we ourselves, of course, become the main characters in the stories, right? So as the protagonists, we are the heroes of our own hero journey. And it becomes very easy to understand why we would think that anybody who disagrees with us must be in some way evil or ignorant or stupid. But so my hope is that by realizing this, by being aware that this kind of storytelling is going on all the time, that we are able to realize that there is maybe no objective truth out there, about whether we should be socialists or capitalists, whether we should be liberal or conservative, that outside of human needs and our own biological makeup, none of these things really exist or matter, to the universe in itself. And although some people might think that this makes everything seem meaningless, I'm not sure that it does, right? Because I think that human beings are able to understand, for example, that we are all mortal and we're all going to die one day. And yet we still have, we don't all succumb to existential dread, and we still are able to have our ambitions and dreams and desires to write books, attend webinars, and get haircuts. So I think that we are able to both realize that things are made up, but also still believe in them. To know that things are meaningless and still find them very meaningful. My own example would be football, right? When I play soccer with my friends, if you look at it from an abstract point of view, it's just a bunch of people running around trying to put a round object into a rectangular space, which makes no real sense, but yet we find it really enjoyable and really meaningful to us. So I am hoping that by having this critical awareness that the stories that we believe in, that we care about, are really just as good or bad as the ones that other people who disagree with us or don't, or even opposed to us, what they believe and care about, right? They'll be able to, on the one hand, fight for the things we believe in, right? To be able to try to shape the post-COVID-19 world the way we want, while realizing that the people who are against us are also doing exactly the same thing, right? That we're all living inside stories, that we're all trying to tell ourselves stories and trying to persuade other people of our stories. And maybe this awareness will allow us to become less attached to a particular story, while at the same time making us realize that we all have this common ground of storytelling, and that could be a way to start to understand each other and work together to build a better future. Okay, that's it. Oops, sorry.
Thank you, Sunny. Now, may I invite Sasi to share with us his thoughts?
Thank you. First and foremost, thank you to the Workers' Party Youth Wing for inviting me to this panel. I'm still pinching myself. I can't believe I'm on the same panel as Marvel Man Sunny Liu. It's such an honor to share the panel. And it's appropriate, I think, that he talked about storytelling. Because I too have a story to tell. It's a story of reimagining ourselves. It's always a good time to reimagine ourselves. And a pandemic is a particularly good time for it. The ancient Greeks thought that plagues and pestilences were a sign that something is rotten in the state. A sign from the gods that the rulers had erred, a failure of leadership, that a new dispensation is necessary. We too have been laid bare. In the blink of an eye, we have moved from gold standard to cautionary tale, from one nation, one people, to two communities, low-wage workers and the rest. And despite the spin of the spin doctors, the virus has prevailed. We are one people. The powerless and the disabled, the elderly poor, lesbians and gays and queer and transgender people, and our non-binary brothers and sisters. But to include them all in the story, to include them all as one, we must reimagine ourselves. Reimagine forging a new conscience for the nation. And here's how I propose we do it. Give the arts a place at the main table. Stop treating the arts like an instrument for other ends, economic, social, political. The arts are not about utility or usefulness. That rubbish will lead to the bankruptcy of the imagination. Soon, we won't be able to tell art apart from propaganda and from feel-good school assembly songs. The arts are essential to our lives, the lifeblood of our imagination. It feeds our souls, is part of our very being. Treat it as it is. Treat it as a capital good, as we do health, security, utilities, and water. Art is not about the number of performances or exhibitions. It's not about buildings and institutions and burgeoning bureaucracies. Art resides in the people, in our capacity to both make it and receive it. And if it matters at all, it matters because of the people. Second point I want to make is resist racism in Singapore. Acknowledge the failure of multiculturalism. We aren't a multicultural society. We are multicultural only in name. There's no understanding about the subtleties of difference, of race, color, and creed. For all our racial harmony days and interfaith dialogues and our unanimous love for roti prata and chicken rice, our neighbors mostly remain strangers. Their cultural needs are alien to most of us, and to many of us still lack empathy and even tolerance for others. We are not a multicultural society. We are a plural monocultural society, a monoculturalism conceived, concocted, and dictated by the state. And that's why we have never learned as individuals to sit with our discomfort of otherness. Otherness is discomforting. Color, creed, body odor, dietary preferences, mannerisms, speech. Whenever it is othered, it is discomforting. But we have never learned to sit with that discomfort, to ask questions of that discomfort, to engage the other and find a way of living, of connecting with otherness. This is a failure of our multiculturalism in Singapore. Finally, to resist racism, we must acknowledge majoritarian privilege. This is the unearned advantages, benefits, and access to resources and power that accrue to those born in the majority. Majoritarian privilege is both the legacy and the cause of racism. Majoritarian privilege is the reason why, regardless of race, language, and religion, could still turn out to be a lie in Singapore. And we have never acknowledged it. We have never talked about it. And it's about time that we do this. Finally, I would say that we need to imagine a new compact between citizens and the state. And I would urge you to start thinking about this new compact by thinking about Article 14 of the Constitution. Every citizen of Singapore has the right to freedom of speech and expression. All citizens of Singapore have the right to assemble peaceably and without arms. And all citizens of Singapore have the right to form associations. Many of us are surprised that freedom of speech and expression is actually enshrined in our Constitution. It is understandable. These rights have had the stuffing beaten out of them by serial legislation enacted by successive parliaments, restricting, conditioning, and limiting them to the point of oblivion. Every Singaporean child will tell you those rights are not absolute. we've taught our children too well to forget that these rights do exist. And as citizens, we are entitled to these rights, if not absolutely, then at least fully and completely. We forget to teach our children that it is only the contingency of politics that denies these rights to us. And we can reimagine our politics. We can change it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasi. Next, I'd like to invite Kiran to share with us her views.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for inviting me on this panel. I think I'm incredibly honored to be speaking as next to such amazing people. And I think following Sasi and Sonny's theme of narrative, as a fresh environmental studies graduate and an environmental activist, perhaps then this is my narrative. And I also see that in the survey, environment ranks quite highly on what people think the government has done. But I'll first recommend you to check out SG Climate Rally's Green Watch paper. And I think in looking at reimagining from my lens, I hope I can show that environmental and social issues are deeply intertwined, and these issues are very much political. So firstly, the COVID-19 pandemic has had very grave socioeconomic impacts, and I think we see that. And many academics, civil society groups, communities, and individuals have noticed these glaring gaps that we perhaps have ignored and stepped up, be it to raise awareness, pool resources, but most importantly, engage in discourse that takes aim at the structural changes that we very badly need to see. And COVID as a public health crisis comes with a lot of great policy challenges, because as Singapore is trying to control the health impacts of this crisis, we are also now looking at economic recovery. And I think as the title of this webinar states, instead of starting to tweak issues here and there, we need to really look at reimagining what a post-COVID Singapore in terms of our society and economy needs to look like. So about recovery, I'm actually now agreeing with this eco-business article that does talk on green recovery post-COVID. And in dealing with all the different fallouts in the short term, immediate stimulus measures definitely must prioritize saving lives and minimizing the pandemic's heavy toll on our society and livelihoods. We know that there are lives at stake that need immediate attention and saving. But moving forward, policymakers and business leaders must work to ensure that where possible, green initiatives such as low carbon investments and building societal resilience are integrated into our long-term recovery plans. Hence, this makes us think about what kind of stimulus and recovery packages do we need to envision in a post-COVID world that will help us build this resilience for future health or environmental crisis as a society. So speaking of this, one example that I wanted to bring up was the Emerging Stronger Task Force that is currently made up of 15 industry leaders who are from the petrochemicals, the banks, real estate, and agribusinesses. And this task force actually then feeds suggestion into the Future Economy Council that looks at the next phase of industry transformation. And I think very recently, this task force has been criticized to be lacking diversity. So in talking about diversity, I remember MP Sylvia Lim and NMP Anthea Ong raised questions in Parliament about how it lacks diversity in gender, in race, and socioeconomic representation, and even industry representation. So Ms. Anthea Ong said that if we want a flexible and responsive society that is able to absorb shocks and rebound from them, I believe we must recalibrate current power structures for a fairer economy that considers key stakeholders in our economic system equally. Furthermore, I remember the Future Economy Council being mentioned in the budget and was a little disheartened that there wasn't plans or priorities on sustainable transitions or sustainability, even though these are things that could be included in their other plans. So it just seems to me that we fall short on addressing the climate crisis in trying to future-proof our economy and society. So for me, I see that the climate crisis and the COVID pandemic are extremely linked, and there are more than enough studies on this. And these crises are going to occur in very different ways, be it locust swarms, fires, natural disasters, and here maybe extreme weather patterns. So a bunch of us climate activists recently published an article on Continentalists that provides an overview of climate-related parliamentary questions And one interesting question that stuck out to me was one which asked about whether we could consider replacing HDB doors to a stronger model because there's been an increase in volatility of our weather patterns. So I think from this, as a youth, the climate crisis has very real impacts and it hits very different people differently. It is a bread and butter issue, and its impacts are also very closely linked to socioeconomic inequalities, healthcare, and jobs. So when we think about setting policies and plans for the future, we need to think about one that is green and that is just and equitable. So as a youth, growing up in Singapore and in this pandemic and, in the background of a bigger climate crisis, I'm extremely fearful about the Singapore that I will be living in the next 40 years, because the consequences of inaction now will be heavily felt by me and my peers. And that's why I also think we see a rise in youth activism in various social issues. It's a very scary time to be growing up in, and the climate crisis thus, as much as we talk about how different people have different ways of what we think moving forward, there are very real consequences, and climate crisis is a reality for me and my friends. And this is definitely no easy feat, and it requires a lot of planning and imagination to look beyond our existing narratives of economic growth, efficiency that we have been very used to. And I think there are already solutions and imaginations provided by civil society groups, academics, practitioners, and even youths in this space. And there needs to be more space for this collective reimagining that's outside state narratives. And I hope that these voices will be valued and that people of all ages will be able to add their voice to imagining a more green and just future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran. I can hear the urgency, the tone of urgency coming out from her call for action now before it's too late. And so far, we have a very different perspectives for post-COVID Singapore. And we're not done yet. We still have next speaker, our next panelist, Damien. Welcome, Damien.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, everyone. Again, I'd like to echo all the sentiments about how privileged we all are to be on this panel and in each other's company, and for the opportunity to share our thoughts and views on the future of Singapore, which all of us have a stake in. Today, I think the main issue that I want to focus on is education. Education is something that I find that's very close to my heart, and it's largely shaped by my experience growing up in Singapore's education system through what we colloquially know as neighborhood schools, right? I was a neighborhood school student from primary school, secondary school, all the way junior college. And the company that I had in school was extremely valuable for me. But I know that our education system doesn't work for everyone. And the two issues in particular that concern me is one, how do we make sure our education system doesn't exacerbate inequality, and to make sure that it promotes social mobility. And the second concern that I have also is how do we ensure that our education system unlocks the potential of as many students as possible, and not just those of the academically inclined. And these are not new concerns or problems, and we always knew, and we must have known, that this was always going to be a problem given our exam-based meritocratic system. On the mobility front, we already see, elite schools and government schools attracting very, very different types of students. A 2016 study by the Singapore's Children's Society showed that 30% of those in elite schools live in private housing compared to 2% in government secondary schools. 66.3% of those in elite schools have at least come from households with at least one parent who come from university compared to 28% of those in government schools. And 42% of those from elite schools come from households with more than $10,000 in monthly income compared to 7% in government schools. And I think the answer to these two concerns is in some sense linked, given the nature of the problem, which is our education system's focus on exams and on academics. Now, I'd like to recognize at the outset that MOE has made important moves away from exams in primary school. But I don't think we've gone far enough because the PSLE is still there. And the effects of exam down the road in secondary school and then in junior college and in polytechnics still makes the PSLE as one of those life-altering events. And even with subject bending in secondary schools, the curriculum is still going to be academically inclined. And so, I mean, the problem with an exam-based system is fairly well known, right? Teachers are pressured to prepare students for exam rather than to teach. Students are prepared for exams rather than learn, as well as the amount of the impact on self-esteem that not doing well in exams has on those who are not academically inclined. But I think the other gap that is not talked about, and this is something that I felt coming up through the neighborhood school system, is what I call the social capital gap, such as how much students are exposed to the world beyond their classroom, their networks, and so on. Because those from better off families are going to have more opportunities to travel, to participate in internships, to meet people from a broader social circle, and in so doing, have different types of conversations. And this is in turn going to help them broaden their understanding of the world. It's going to boost their confidence, and it's going to motivate them. And I think this is a gap that the education system needs to try and close, and it's going to be difficult to try and close it so long as we focus on exams. So I don't propose to have all the answers, but I want to try and sketch out how I think the education system has to be transformed further. And I think we need to act swiftly. That doesn't mean immediate change, but we have to act with more sense of urgency, because these are structural problems, and once they take root, they're going to be very, very hard to correct. So we cannot be complacent and say that social mobility is not a big issue yet, and then wait for it to become a big issue before we correct it, because all research has shown that investment in education has to come very, very early on, because remedial measures and peripheral kind of tinkering is going to cost more, and it's not going to be as effective. So I'm not really going to talk too much about preschool education because I'm not too familiar with that. After all, it's quite a while since I attended preschool. But I want to focus on primary school. But before I do that, I think it is important for there to be intensive intervention at the preschool level. And I recognize MOE's moves on this front. And we need to continue to see whether we should be doing more or can do more, especially for the low income, where preschool is really a leveler up. But I want to talk more about primary and secondary school. And I think the focus has to be at making learning fun at the primary school level. And by this, I don't just mean removing the element of exams, but it's about making outdoor learning more commonplace, right? Kids should be brought to see the outside world as much as possible, to see wildlife, architecture, meet new people. This not only makes learning fun, but it makes it relatable. And it also gives those from not so well-off families the exposure which they might not otherwise have. So this requires a greater rollback of examination so that teachers will not be pressured into preparing kids for exams, and also to make sure that our kids are not going to suffer from low self-esteem for not doing well in exams. Because different students learn differently and at different pace, we might want to consider having teachers taking care of a child or set of students for an extended period of time versus a change of teachers every single year, and then the new teacher needs to rediscover the pace and the style of learning that a particular student has. And then by the time he or she discovers it, it's time to hand the student over to the next teacher. And so my starting point for primary school education is very simple, and it's as Sir Ken Robinson observed: all kids love to learn, but not all kids enjoy education. So if we want lifelong learning, we need lifelong curiosity. And the focus shouldn't be on output, but it should be on culture. And I think primary school is the place for us to cultivate that culture. And secondary school is where we need to see a more intensive intervention to close that social gap, which I was talking about. So students should as far as possible, be exposed to the more complicated aspects of life, right? They get the chance to embark on small work attachments, and get the chance to, again, go further and discover how the world works and not just what is out there in the world. And I think the other thing that is important and is worth considering is allowing every secondary school student to be given the chance to go overseas. And they don't have to go far. ASEAN countries are good. I mean, we've been talking about having a greater connection to ASEAN and Asia. And then, of course, we need generous subsidies for students whose family cannot afford to pay for that. So all these programs are going to place an even heavier burden on teachers. And I understand that our teachers are busy, so we may need to hire more teachers or keep numbers constant as class sizes go down. And we should also consider hiring teachers, especially at the secondary school level, from who have experience outside of the education system, to bring breadth to the teaching ranks. Teaching should still remain a profession, and those who want to join from outside the teaching service have to go through professional training. But I think there's scope for us to hire from a broader range of candidates, and this breadth of experience will in turn trickle down to our students as well. I mean, maybe we can find a spot in the education system for an SAF general or two. Just a joke, just a joke. Don't take it too seriously. So it's not just about teach less, learn more, but teach differently so that our kids learn better. And when we deal with our education reforms to our education system, we cannot just ask. We cannot just put it in the hands of people who have done well in school. We need to speak to those who the education system hasn't worked well for. So I think I'm going to leave it as that, except to say this to end off, that our dropout rates in school might be low, our attendance rates might be high, but we need to ask how many of our students are genuinely enjoying school or are genuinely learning well in school, if to determine if they get the most out of formal education in Singapore. And I think in doing that, when we can unlock the potential of all our kids, we are not just going to do well as an economy, but those who might not be academically inclined, and this tends to be those who are from less well-off families, are going to be able to benefit as much as those from well-off families. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damien, for that very thoughtful piece on education. We have been receiving quite a lot of questions, but I do hope that the webinar participants continue to keep the questions coming, and we will try and answer as many of them as possible later. Now let's, for the last but not least, let me invite Bauji to share with us his view. Bauji, unmute yourself first.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. I was quite disheartened to look at your survey results, because the two things that I want to talk about, or the two issues I wanted to talk about, are not in the survey at all. One of them is media. The one issue is professional, which is media. The other is partly personal, but partly national, and that is aging. And I don't see both these issues in your list, which kind of tells me what the preoccupation of the people that you interviewed. What is your preoccupation? Doesn't matter, but I think these two issues are very important. When I talk about media, and because I've been in media for a long time, it's a wonder that how Singapore, that calls itself a first world country, first world society, doesn't have a media that fits its first world status. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, first, at a very important and at a very primary level, the kind of control that the government has on media. And the control is at one level, at a very serious level, the government laws, and one of the laws is, which has been there for a long time, is a license to publish a newspaper. So if you want to publish a newspaper, you have to get a license from the government. And that's a 1-year license, and you have to renew it every year. And of course, if the government doesn't renew your license, it doesn't have to give a reason. So that's the first. Second one, which again not many people know of, is the shareholding of a public listed company like Singapore Press Holdings. In the 1970s, under the Newspaper Presses Printing Act, the shareholding structure was changed by the government to make sure that the shareholder is not one single person or one single entity. It was kind of spread out. But what I think is the devil in this detail is that the government introduced a shareholding structure by giving 3%, making the company give 3% of its shares to a group of people who, my interpretation, would protect the government at all costs. So, and they will be in the boards. So to appoint the editor of a newspaper, of course, it has to seek the approval of the board. And as far as the voting rights are concerned, the 3% of shareholders have much higher voting rights, powers than the ordinary shareholders. So you can see where the so-called bottleneck for media is. So that's at one level. Now, moving away from the rules in laws, moving away from that, you still have the government, for want of a better word, interfering in media. What do I mean by that? You look at the chairman, I think the chairman now, previously was executive chairman. Look back from the time of, from 1990s, I think, we had chairmen or executive chairman who were former cabinet ministers. So you had Mr. Lim Kim San, you had Mr. Tony Tan, and you had Mr. S.R. Nathan, and now you have Lee Boon Yang, who was a former manpower minister. Now, from even below that level, so the government is still not happy. The controls are not enough for them. I'll come to what I think is a reason for that. The next level is the CEOs. The CEOs in the past many years have all been top civil servants. The most recent one is an army general. So you have at different levels, the controls are so they are not just sweeping, but they go even to the extent of who is appointed as CEO, as chairman. I'm not sure whether we will reach a stage where the editor is also appointed by the government. Maybe they don't need to, because you already have enough checks. Now, I said, why does the government do this or continue to do this? And I think it goes back to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who never trusted media. Even though the media is under the control of the government, there are laws to control them, still the government is still believes that I cannot trust the media. It goes back to Lee Kuan Yew a long time ago, how he looked at the Western press. And I still remember one occasion where he told editors, he said he was very unhappy with the photograph, his photograph, the photograph that I think the Straits Times used. This was many years ago when he was still Prime Minister. And he said, he asked the editors, what are you all trying to do? Are you all trying to bring me down? Because that's what the British press did to Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, because Harold Wilson, when the media decided that Harold Wilson was not the right person, they began to use a series of pictures over a number of days showing Harold Wilson in a very bad light. So it goes to that minute example, if I can say that. So there's a lot of distrust, despite bringing the media under its fold, despite so many controls. The next part of this story about media is, and I think I'll not be completing the picture if I don't talk about the journalists and the editors. I mean, I worked in a system which was, of course, there were many issues there, but I worked under editors, and I call them the last of the Mohicans. They were even occasions, not many occasions, but on the rare occasions when they had to put their foot down with Lee Kuan Yew. And I described that time as when Lee Kuan Yew was at his rogue best. Some of the editors stood their ground. I don't want to go into the details, but they are all available in the public domain. And of course, 2 of them paid a very heavy price, lost their jobs. One continued to stay on for a long time. And after he wrote, I'm talking about Mr. Chong Yip Sing, who was the editor-in-chief. I think he was the longest lasting editor-in-chief in the Straits Times. He wrote a book called OB Marcus, where he actually talked about government intervention, which was talked quite directly about government intervention. And what happened after that? He lost his ambassadorship. And so even people who have done a good job for the government or protecting the government, but even if you go against the government for one small thing, which I consider small, you pay a price. It's also partly a lesson to the others. So coming to the present media scene, I think all of you have your own views on it. And I would say that the media today that we see is very different and definitely not as good as the media we used to have. There were many occasions, and I have been party to that, not all the time, but sometimes, where the editors will put up strong arguments that this is not the way to go. Sometimes, on the rare occasion, the government listens. Most times they don't listen. But my point is, it is very important in a Singapore context that the editors, behind closed doors at least, should put up their point of view. From what I hear, it doesn't happen at all. If it really happens, then you will not see the kind of media that you see now. And why is it that the journalists, I would talk more about the editors. Why is it that the editors of today don't do what the previous editors did? And I can only think of one reason, or maybe 2 reasons. One is they have been so well, they have taken in the government propagandas so well that they can't even think of alternative measures. So they buy the arguments all the time. Second point is that they have seen what has happened to editors of the previous generation, losing of jobs, right? So they said, I don't want to be in that position. So is my livelihood at stake? So, and the fundamental point here is, I believe that it is time, whether it is post-COVID or not, the time has come to relax, take away some of these rules, relax these rules, because I don't believe that we have editors, at least for the time being, who will go and sabotage Singapore. I don't think so. Right? So why is it that the government cannot relax? Is it because nobody thinks about it? Is it because nobody agitates against it? As your survey showed, nobody cares about media. But media is such a fundamental part of Singapore society, right? So I'll stop here. Now I'll go into the second topic. I'm not sure whether I'm on time or taking away a lot of your time. I'll keep that very short, and that is aging. I'm now 72 years old. Because of this COVID period, 3 months, 2.5 months, I feel I'm like 80 years old. Because I think I've aged very fast, sitting at home, not being able to go out, not being able to meet my friends, not being able to go to the coffee shop to have a drink. And again, at the aging story is at two levels. One is at government. The biggest, if you ask me, I mean, I'm saying this from a purely anecdotal, using anecdotal evidence. All my friends, most of my friends are of my age. Most of them have retired. But most of them want to do something which is work, because they want to occupy themselves. Many of them cannot do, maybe their skills are not there, maybe the employers are not giving them any jobs, You look at the retirement age, right? What is the retirement age now? Minimum retirement age is 62. And it is going up and to 70 by 2030. That is 10 years from now. I just cannot understand why it has to take 10 years to change your retirement age. Right? That's first point. Second point is, what is your longevity? The government has taken very good care of us. The longevity is now 85. So what does a person who has to retire maybe at 62 or 64, what does he do until he or she does until the person is 85? He just needs to keep himself employable. And it is not a question, and most of my friends tell me, I'm not asking for big salary, I'm not asking for the same salaries. That even if you pay me an honorarium and ask me to work for 3 days a week, I'm fine. So why? So that's at the structural level. Now at the human level, I think it is a very, very ageist society. I don't think we have respect for our older people. Generally speaking, of course, I mean, I find it such a hassle, trying to walk to the MRT train, to the MRT station. People pushing you from behind, or you feel you are being pushed behind, from behind. And of course, when you reach 70, 72, you are not as sprightly as you used to be. You walk slower, your gait is slower, but people are pushing you. They have no regard for the old people, So, and how to tap and the older people, I mean, all of you have fathers and mothers, right? The older people have a lot to offer. Their experience, their wisdom, right? The experience, when I talk to younger journalists, and I talk to them about some of the things that have happened in journalism, they don't know. I mean, if you don't know your history, your media history, how can you be a good journalist? It's not just media history, but even your institutional knowledge about events in Singapore. They don't know, right? If you speak to them about J.B. Jeyaretnam, for example, they know very vaguely, but they don't know the real details, which are all actually available, right? If you go and do your research, they're all available. But because they didn't live through that experience, and when they now become journalists, they forget everything, right? So the point is really that these two are actually very important issues. Media, purely from the fact that we are a modern society, and we cannot. I mean, the PAP government keeps saying we don't need to be checked. We will check ourselves, right? I don't buy that argument, because what happened in 2011, the elections of 2011, there were enough evidence to show that the PAP was heading for a major, humiliating victory, if you want to call it that. There was evidence, but the PAP, the ruling government did not, more or less did nothing, right? So I don't buy the argument, whether it is for me or for any other party or organization, that they can check themselves. I don't believe that. And of course, my second one, the second point is really an appeal. Please take care of older people. Yep, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Bauji. Thank you for sharing about your impressions and your hopes for media changes in future, and also your concerns about ageism, about how the elderly, how they are treated, and the challenges they will face, our elderly, in the coming years. Time is moving on, and I would like to move on to the next section. And that really is a short section where I will actually invite our panelists to ask any question they would like to ask of their fellow panelists. And may I ask, does Sunny has any question? Yes, would you like to, and who would you like to ask?
Hi, okay, so my question is for Damien, actually, and education. I think a lot of us have the sense that Singapore's system might be a bit strict and all that, but it's how we get students to be good at things like math and science, for example, right? But at the same time, I have a vague awareness that a country like Finland or some of the Scandinavian countries actually have pretty liberal open systems, and yet they also have very high scores in math and science. I'm wondering if this is true and what you think about the need for rote learning for certain parts of education versus a more open, liberal, progressive kind of approach. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I don't think there is necessarily a trade-off. I think so. Those who have studied the Finnish education system have shown, research has shown, that there is no trade-off between switching away from a rote learning. That switching away from a rote learning system doesn't necessarily entail a sacrifice of literacy, numeracy, and the quality of learning that our students get. And in fact, I think the research suggests that it's going to enhance that, because my experience, everyone's experience would indicate that there are certain subjects which we enjoy, which we do well at, and the knowledge that we gain from those subjects we retain in our minds far beyond secondary school, and then others we discard after finishing the exams. So that tells us that doing well, that just because our kids do well at exams, that doesn't mean that they are well equipped with knowledge, and that doesn't necessarily also equip them to be, and I don't want to use this phrase too often, lifelong learners. I mean, I think it's a good phrase, but it can't just be reduced to a catchphrase. So I think the school must be about how we cultivate learners. Of course, there are certain subjects that we want our kids to be good at. I mean, literacy, numeracy, basic stuff. But then there's a question of whether we are then sacrificing, in trying to equip them with what we think is good for them, are we then sacrificing their love for learning? And are we also then stunting their development in other areas? Because we might have prodigies and geniuses or people who do well doing all sorts of things, but calculation and writing essays. And the question is whether our economy, not just our economy, but whether our society is going to be better off for that. And I think that we will be, based on my experience and as well as the numbers that we've seen so far. Oops.
Thank you, Damien. Sasi, do you have any question?
Yes, I do. And this is to Balji, actually. I mean, the point he made about the need to relax the rules that muzzle the media. Nobody can argue with that. But I'm just questioning whether, is that still relevant in an age when mainstream media or legacy media have been shoved into the wings, and the Straits Times, for instance, is no longer the media that sets the agenda. And social media is clearly enroached into this sphere, and even the ministers are directly using Facebook and other social media platforms to talk to the people. Do you still think that easing the rules will make that much of a difference?
Well, Sasi, it's actually a very, very good question. And when preparing myself for this session, that was something that I didn't focus on. But let me tell you that the Straits Times, we always talk about the Straits Times, is still very important, in the sense that it has still got a wide reach. But I think your point really is, does it still set the agenda? The government is using the Straits Times to set the agenda. And if you read, comments, right, on social media, of course, some people say that, or not some people, many people say that these are all vigilantes, PAP vigilantes who go in there and make noise, But you will find that there are people who still believe in the Straits Times, and also reading the Straits Times, or at least the way I read the Straits Times, you have to read between the lines. If you read between the lines, if you have a lot of patience and perseverance, you can get quite a lot of information from the Straits Times. So in a direct answer to your question is yes, I think Straits Times still has some importance, some impact, not as much as it used to have, say, 10 years, 15 years ago. Whether that, and also not to forget that the social media, online media, they don't have the resources to go out there and do reporting. So most of them are, what shall I say, are doing analysis, one or two people or three people, other than, let's say, Mothership, for example, and Yahoo is the other one. But these are not, I don't see them as big influencers yet. Their influence is growing. I don't know how long that will take. But I think the bigger question to me, I always ask, as the Straits Times revenue keeps dropping every quarter, right? And it's not just circulation revenue, but it's also advertising revenue. I call it the double whammy. I've never seen this before. I've never heard, during my time in SPH, this never happened. In fact, the editor-in-chief used to say we don't have to worry about circulation because as long as there are new HDB blocks of flats are built, our circulation will go up. Now, if you look at it today, so many, the HDB flats are being built, but the circulation is going down. And so I think that is, we are going to come, I hope it happens during my lifetime, we are going to come to the crunch, it's going to be crunch time soon for newspapers like SPH. That is why they have, I would say quite smartly, they have themselves decided that media may not be their cash cow. So they have gone into property, they have gone into old folks home, nursing homes, they have gone into building dormitories overseas. So they are spreading their eggs. And one other point that's kind of related to what Sasi mentioned is the biggest stakeholder in this business, the media business means mainstream media business, is the government. And until the government realizes that the Straits Times is of no use to me, they will keep controlling the Straits Times. And this is one thing that I am dumbfounded about. You know, I cannot see why the government don't see this as an issue moving forward, because that is their only source of, for want of a better word, only credible source or credible platform for them to get across their message. And that is slowly being eroded. But I also expect this government is quite a smart government, quite a cunning government. Expect them to do other things. I don't know what that is. I can only give you the example of before what happened after the 2011 elections. One of the key things that happened, I'm not sure how many people have focused on it. Suddenly, two online websites came out. Ask yourselves why. Who were the funders? Right? Definitely not the people who started those websites. And soon after the 2015 elections, when the PAP won big, the two websites disappeared. Right? So they will do a lot of things to muddy the waters. Sorry, I don't know whether I answered your question, Sasi. Thank you.
Thank you, Baji. Jian, do you have any question for any of our panelists?
Yeah, I do have a question for Sasi. So I think when you were talking about imagining a new compact, right? So, you know, as a youth, people always tell us that, oh, you know, it's so great that youths are getting involved in social issues. And this feels like pats on the back, or initiative just feels like they're pats on the back, while we're not really taken seriously and are often dismissed as naive or inexperienced. But I still think that youth voices are still important because we are the future of society, right? So how do you think society or current political leaders and business leaders can be more intentional in including youth voices in planning for the future of Singapore?
Wow, that's a big question. It may appear as if I think young people are not being listened to, but I do believe that the leadership, particularly the political leadership, is acutely aware of the demography of young people and their concerns. The problem in Singapore is that sometimes the reality on the ground takes time to move up to levels where it's going to impact policy. This is, I think, not just a reality about youth opinions. It's a reality generally. You know, basically the leadership is not listening. The leadership is disconnected, and I think that this is the problem that youths are facing. But at least theoretically, leaders are concerned about you know, listening to the youth, or at least to seem to listen to youth. And I mean, it's just you know, it's just a factor of good democratic politics. You need to listen to the people who are going to ultimately vote for you or not vote for you. And I think, and the best way I think that youth can continue to engage this area is to be active. I mean, activism, advocacy, engaging leadership, engaging everyone from MPs to institutional leaders, and speaking your mind and having your voice in the mix, you know, of the discussions which are going to decide policy. These are the ways. These are time-tested ways, and I think these are the best ways that youth can do for themselves what the leaders may not want to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasi. Damien, do you have any questions?
No, I'd be more than happy to take questions from them. So, but if I could just quickly jump in on Chian's point, I think from experience, sure. I think one way to really be taken seriously, and I think that's the way that your group has been doing, is to yourself take it seriously, in the sense that you know, do our homework on the issues, do the proper research, and come up with concrete proposals. And over time, people will realize that what you've got to say will add value, and then they will listen to you.
Thanks, Damien. Bauji, you have any question for any of the panelists?
Yeah, a couple of questions, but mainly related to the young. And first is Sasi's response. Do you think, Sasi, that of course there's a lot of young people who want to be active, want to take part? But what happens in the home? Do you think that the parents encourage them or discourage them?
I think by and large, the tendency among Singaporean parents is to play it safe, to not rock the boat, to not to swim against the current. This is, I think, by and large, the case in Singapore. But despite this, I'm amazed whenever I attend events where there are young people, people who are basically have been exposed, and I suspect this is also a result of the media and the availability of information today. Unlike the time when I was growing up, I think that as you say, the Straits Times was the sole truth, but that's no longer the case. And the level at which young people are informed and the level at which they know and understand realities about the world, about politics, about society, I think far exceeds what the parents actually do. And this is a good thing. So despite the conservatism of the parents, I think young people still hold out something for the future, and there's something we can hope for.
I'm glad to hear that. And
Can I just
jump
in? Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
Okay,
go ahead.
Please do.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no,
so
the question I had is actually a simple question. Do you think that the education system that the new education minister and some of the things that he's been trying to do, will they meet Singapore's future? Will it be the type of education that we want for our children, grandchildren?
So okay, let me answer that first. I think that he's made fairly significant changes, much needed changes. Are they going to be sufficient to meet the needs of our future? I can't say for sure. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a disaster, right? For sure, it's not going to be a disaster. For sure, we are still going to be able to do fairly well. But I think the question with education is not about whether we are going to be able to do fairly well, but it's whether we can do the best we can, and not just whether we can do the best we can, but whether each of our kids has equal opportunity to do the best that we can. So in short, I think that the changes are good, but I think we can do better. And to come back on your questions about parents, I think firstly, if we are able to inspire our young people enough, parents can only resist an idealistic young person that much, right? An idealistic, passionate young person is an irresistible force, and parents only have that much ability to resist that. But even if, our kids are discouraged from participating in a certain way because of what their parents say, there's nothing to stop us or society or the nation from planting that seed of idealism in them, because at some point they're going to grow up and going to be independent of their parents, and then they can make their own decisions, and they still be young, they still be idealistic, and we still value their contributions as much at that point in time.
Just quickly, I will add to that point, because I think the education what happens in school, I think most of us, from what I've heard my friends say, the blame is always on the teachers, the school system. But nobody talks about the home. What does the home do, right? When the children go against the system or ask very, very difficult questions, I've been to enough homes to see that the parents just shut them up. Not because they want to shut them up, either they are tired or maybe they don't have the answers. And if this child grows up, right, in that kind of an environment, in school, at home, which is where 90% of the time they spend 90% of the time, then what happens? You see, so I think the focus also has to be in the home, how the children are brought up by their parents. Do they give them a chance to express themselves, even if those expressions are not within the bounds of what the government wants? If not, you need two hands to clap. Okay.
I mean, for sure, but I think there's limited things that any government can do with regards to the home. Short of being a very
I'm not asking for the government to intervene in the home.
No, so that's why we need the school to be a safe space and to be a space where that kind of discourse is encouraged and promoted, and that's where kids are empowered to participate in that way. Yeah.
Okay, it's very exciting discussion just between the panelists, and I wish we have a lot more time in this, but we need to give a fair bit of time to our webinar participants and the many questions that flow in. So we'll move on to that now. Unfortunately, we are probably not able to go through all these many questions that have been sent in, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. And some of them are very, very good questions. So let's start on with the first question from Tejesh Kumar Singh. His questions reads as follows. Thank you for taking the time to read my question. My question is directed to Bauji, Sunny, and Sasi. The arts and humanities have been a source of solace for many during these extraordinary circumstances. Many of us have turned to literature, music, film, theatre, and other artistic forms to help us cope with the change that has been inflicted upon us. In a post-COVID situation, how do you think our appreciation for the above will change? May I suggest maybe Sunny can kick off?
Okay, so the question is, let me look at it again. Can you repeat the last part?
In the post-COVID situation, how do you think our appreciation for the above will change?
To be honest, I'm not sure it'll change fundamentally. I think arts, is still considered to be, in a way, a luxury. And it's hard to, even as a practitioner of arts myself, I find it hard to argue against it, because you talk about bread and the famous bread and butter issues. Arts will, for one reason or another, never be on that level. I think I'm just speaking to people who either know policy making level, and they tell me that if you ask a average citizen whether they want tax money spent on arts or whether they want to spend on a bus stop near at home, they always go for the bus stop, right? So to me, I think arts is a curious thing, right? It's so essential to our life. It's so important to us as human beings, but at the same time, it can feel so unessential, right? And off the top of my head, I think one reason might be that arts is, its staying power is actually a problem for it, because we can read Shakespeare today, right, as we did back then. So we don't necessarily need more art all the time, right? There's enough art to go around. There are books, millions of books out there that we get to read, movies you can watch. So I'm not sure people, given a choice between that and something more like a job or economic growth, they would choose arts as focus for tax spending, right? And that in a way that I think is a misunderstanding, because I think, of course, contemporary arts will address contemporary issues in a way that older arts doesn't. And I think that in Singapore especially, Since I look at the art scene here, and a lot of it is dominated by what I would myself classify as middle class or upper class practitioners, because we can afford to take the risk to create art. And in doing so, I think we lose a lot of the voices of the lower classes, lower income classes. And that, I think, would need to be fixed. I'm not sure how it can be fixed, right? I think Sasi talked about the arts support from the government and all that, and I think it's very difficult to change the ecosystem here to allow us to find a way to fund arts which is not government approved. I'm not sure what Sasi's solution to that is. To me, I feel like the fact that most of our funding does still come from the NEC and the NDA creates a lot of problems for long-term growth of arts that's not government mandated.
Sasi, you have a quick answer for that? Sasi, do you have a quick answer for that?
You can't argue with with the books versus butter dichotomy. I guess the problem for me with that is that you are making that dichotomy at all. I don't think that we need to choose between the arts and bread and butter issues. I think that we have, frankly, I think Singapore is wealthy enough to ensure that people can have the culture and the arts that they need and they desire, and they can have the basics that they require in life. I think that there has to be a change in the perception of the people who are holding the purse strings to understand that that we need to look again at these time-worn dichotomies. That's all I want to say.
Thanks, Sasi. Let me, Baoji, you have a quick answer to that? And I'd like to move on to the next question.
No, I don't.
We have quite a few to go. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. And I'd like to choose a question on education. Let me just scroll to that. This question from Irene Sin. She says, interesting, the number one SG do well is education. I'm of a different view. I'd like to ask the panelists of their views of the education system now, such as focus on STEM as opposed to humanities. Is this enough to meet post-COVID world? Do our young have the skills for 21st and 22nd century ahead? Any panelists who wish to answer, please. Damien, perhaps?
Well, I think so. Apart from, I mean, okay, if we are going to look at the system within a kind of academic-based framework, which it is now, then I think at the very minimum we shouldn't put people into the arts and science stream kind of framework, because I think all bits are important. I mean, you need to understand the sciences for people to understand, how we deal with the virus, for example, how we deal with problems like climate change, how we deal with a lot of scientific issues or technical issues in the world. But then we also need the humanities which speaks to us about how we are going to work with other people who disagree with us, how we look back at history and look at the mistakes that humanity has made and try not to make the same mistakes. So in that sense, yes, I don't know if our system has too much of a focus on science, because I've not been in the science stream. But I think that we should get our students to be more well-rounded and not just box them into one category or another. And the problem with that system also is that it influences the kids to think of themselves as humanities people or science people, and then kind of narrow their motivation to learn to particular fields or not. But I think broader than that, we need to have education that is non-academic based. So we need to cultivate leadership skills, collaborative skills, and things like that. And these are things that might not be amenable to be cultivated just within the humanities field or the science field. So I think we need to look at the education system as with much broader lenses and understand that it has much broader objectives as well than teaching and getting our students to learn the things that we want them to learn. Because sorry, I just quickly add, because humanities alone is not going to teach people, not going to equip people with the character and the qualities that they need to survive in the world. Just learning about something is not character building in a sense. And so those things need to be focused on as well.
Thanks, Damien. Let's move on to the next question by Renee Lee. And I'm going to ask you this question. Post-COVID-19, what do you think should be the focus of the government? And do you think the government should continue striving for sustained economic growth? Or should they shift their focus to social inequalities and global issues like climate change? Kiran?
Yeah, I think my question to this is that, I'm aware that the government probably have a lot of priorities. And for me to decide what they should focus on is tough. But I think fundamentally, what I think they should be more focused on is firstly listening to different voices, or at least, when I'm talking about advocacy or activism and civil society in general, I would like to just bring up a point that Damien made about, having your voice in the mix and to be heard or to be recognized as credible means we have to do homework and do research to come up with concrete proposals. I think a lot of activists are already doing that work and a lot of civil society groups are already doing that work, but still we are not being heard. And I think what is missing from that conversation is the fact that there is a very clear power dynamic between who gets listened to and which voices get dismissed then. And with that kind of power dynamic, I don't understand how youths can posture a position to be more credible when fundamentally these civil society groups are voices that people already do not want to listen to. So I think, the government should first focus on processes that can be more inclusive for different groups who have a stake in decision making from various demographics and not just youths. And we need to relook the way that even public consultations are being done and communicated, because, what does really listening to the people mean? And I think about Renee's second point, thank you for raising that up, is that I think we can now see that our strive for sustained economic growth being talked about by so many academics, they have seen that this has resulted in a lot of social inequalities or a lot of the issues that we see today. And I think, I'm not sure about shifting their focus, but I believe that there is a need to rethink and relook the way that our economy and our society is being structured. And there have been a lot of alternative models brought up by Green New Deals all over the world about degrowth, about steady state economies. And of course, they may not all apply to Singapore, but there are learnings that I think Singapore can adopt in moving away from one that has been driven by GDP growth. And, there are already people who are pushing out operational policies beyond just ideology that I think that the government should start looking into and perhaps shift their focus to one that places, social equality and I guess sustainability in their agenda. And perhaps that would frame the way that future policies are being crafted.
Thank you, Qiyun. Next, I have a question from the audience, Mr. Hiskandar Zulkarnain, and this is addressed to Bauji. And it's not a question, but it's more of asking Bauji what he thinks of this view that Hiskandar has. And let me read. A decreasing respect for the old is a phenomenon that extends beyond our borders. It is in line with the OK boomer mindset that the older people are partially responsible for the grimmer economic conditions they experience now. This is, of course, not the case in Singapore, certainly not as much as in the US or UK. However, I would suggest that the real problem is a breakdown in familiar relationships, which is in large part driven by the capitalist economy that we are entrenched in. Over to you, Bauji.
Yep. So the question is, the real issue with aging is in the home. Am I correct?
Yes. family breakdown and relationship.
Pauji, you need to unmute yourself.
Families don't take care of their elderly. Is that the point?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, family
Yeah.
breakdown. Yeah.
Yeah.
Breakdown relationships within the family. That's how I read it.
Yeah. Okay. I don't deny that that is a problem, but I don't believe that that is a major problem. It may become a major problem over time. And so I talked about the public, and in that way it is also a family problem, although honestly I must say I didn't focus on that issue. But I don't get the sense, in my own interactions with people, that that is the big issue. I don't get that sense. Maybe I'm interacting with the wrong people.
Thanks, Monty. Next, I have a question from Constance Singham, and her question is addressed to Sasi. How do we learn and teach the next generation to sit with our discomfort, quote unquote, sit with our discomfort?
Thank you, Constance, for asking that. Yeah, that's a difficult question, isn't it? I guess there are a number of things that must happen. I tried to say that one of the reasons why we don't do that as a people in Singapore is because of the failure of multiculturalism, or the model of multiculturalism that we've experienced, since independence. That basically we are not a really multicultural society, and that we are essentially a plural monocultural society. So that's one of the fundamental problems, I feel. The other reason I think is because there is a deep distrust of the people by the government. There is a deep distrust about human nature, about the possibility of people engaging and interacting, across cultures. Deep distrust in the fact that we can learn to understand otherness, that we have the capacity, we can develop the sensibility and the sensitivities to understand difference. And this is something I think that is reflected in the kind of policing of interracial and intercultural interactions in Singapore. The kind of disciplining that the people of Singapore have become accustomed to. Of course, we can always point to the fact, look how harmonious we are. But harmony is not just about the lack of conflict. Harmony must mean something deeper than that. It must mean understanding. It must mean empathy. It must mean a sense of tolerance. And this comes about because, in fact, we are segregated racially and culturally, and even in terms of religion. We are deeply segregated. And I suppose the answer to your question, Constance, is that we need to trust our people. We need to trust human nature. We need to take risks as a society for interactions to take place. It may not be something that our leaders have the stomach for, but I think we pay a price as a society if we don't do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasi. Perhaps, June, you want to weigh in on this from your own perspective?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Constance, for that question. And I think the point I wanted to address was, I guess there was a mention of next generation. And I think Sasi actually brought up a lot of the very structural and root issues or themes that we have to think about when we think about, sitting with our discomfort. So I just wanted to raise that, in sitting with discomfort is not a generational problem. I think everybody in Singapore does have to sit with this discomfort in a very challenging time. And I think sitting with discomfort does look like, youth could be fearing a very uncertain future and the impact on their family and livelihoods. And I think while we are growing up in a globalized world, recognizing that there are very real fears is something that we need to address. But there are also those that we need to recognize who are uncomfortable because of the fact that they benefit from status quo that's actually being challenged in these times. So I think everybody needs to sit with discomfort and the different kinds of discomfort. And in sitting with this discomfort, I hope that we can work together as a society rather than being separated or further divided, but more together and communal and caring for one another in order to move forward in post-COVID.
Thank you, Kiran. We have one question from James Lim. This is for Damien. Damien, in your view, do you think that there can be more purposive public policy for developing social capital for the less fortunate beyond travel exposure? For instance, do you think that a specialized agency should be formed to develop social capital with after-school programs, mentorships, company internship, etc.? Yeah, just keep your question short because we're going to wrap up soon.
Sure.
Your answer short. Thank you.
I haven't really thought about this in this way. I mean, because this is part of development at the education age, in the early age, I think, so okay, if you're talking about at the early age, then I think the MOE should take care of it and should be able to take care of it. And then at the, I mean, now everything actually it's under MOE. So I don't know whether we need a specialized agency or such, but and it's something I probably should think about further and would think about further. But I would say this, which is that we need to be sensitive as to how we do it, because the manner in which assistance is given, or if it is, the manner in which we think of assistance affects how it's given, how it's perceived by the recipients as well. And I think it needs to be approached from a solidarity perspective, from an empowerment perspective, not from an assistance perspective. And perhaps because this quite falls within the remit of MOE, I think that it is time for MOE to consider making social mobility one of its explicit goals. If it already, I mean, it isn't, it's quite implicit in what they do, and I know that a lot of teachers care about it, but I think that it should be made explicit in the work that MOE does.
Thank you, Damien. We are running short of time, and we should be wrapping up soon, but I've seen two questions that came in, which I think they are quite suitable for our panelists to address in their wrapping up as such. And so I will read these questions and perhaps invite our panelists to consider stating a view to this as you wrap up, in addition to whatever they may want to say, which you may have prepared beforehand. So the first question comes from R.Y. Yong, and he says to all panelists, which is one concrete thing that you would change immediately about policy in your respective domains if given the power? And the second question from Ms. Pamela Low, what values do you think COVID has taught us and how can we reinforce them post-COVID? Okay, so does anybody want to start first? Sunny, would you like to start first? Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I didn't really prepare like a closing statement, so I was answer the questions quite directly. In terms of changes to policy, if I was given power, I think from what I'm hearing from the panelists in general, a lot of what we're talking about is diversity, right? Our main critique partly is that the mainstream narrative is very dominated by the, like a mono voice, right? It's not diverse enough. And I think that's the same with the arts. So to change that, I guess I would, one thing we could do is to change the arts funding model, right? In that sense, I think the NAC, for example, could be much less of a stat board and much more of an arts agency, much more independent in its governance and the way it distributes funds. And even if you look at it in terms of its own rationale, where the government likes to say that it's taxpayers' money and therefore we can't spend it on things that are anti-government or critical. To me, that in itself does not make sense, because if you look at the voting patterns of the every election, there's at least 30% block that tends to be critical of the government in that sense. So by that logic, taxpayer funds, at least 30% should be devoted to projects, whether arts or otherwise, that are not pro-government. In terms of what changes COVID-19 might create, I think for me the main thing really is that it has given us a sense that change is possible, right? I think, again, like what I said earlier about how I never thought courses would be closed, never thought Olympics would be postponed. Things that seem impossible, I think, before COVID-19, maybe now seem to be doable, as long as we have the will to do it, we have a reason to do it, whether it's in environment, whether it's in education, whether it's in the arts. I think it gives us a sense that as long as there's collective will, change can happen.
Thank you, Sunny. Sasi, you want to share your views?
Yeah, okay. I didn't prepare any sort of closing statements, but I'll start with the second question first about what changes you think COVID-19 has forced us to confront. Did you ever think that our nurses and frontline health workers would get a 1 month salary bonus? Did you ever think that delivery men and the guys who were stocking supermarkets were essential to our economy? Did you ever think that the cabinet would take a 1 month pay cut so that the money could be distributed to other people? Did you think that such redistribution could be possible, or was even conceivable before this pandemic? Did you think that such welfareism, such care for the daily needs of the people who are most deprived in Singapore was possible? Did we think that computers and other devices could be distributed to children, poor children, so that they could partake of home-based learning? Did we think that this sort of distributive justice was possible in our economy before? No. The simple answer was no, because there was only one univocal point of view, which said that the market had to determine our future. That's no longer the case now. We are looking at a new world. We have to rethink the place of market economics. We have to rethink distribution of resources. We have to rethink our anathema to a universal basic income. We have to rethink our antipathy to minimum wage. And we have to rethink what is essential for us as a people. And I think while we are doing this rethinking, as Sunny has already pointed out, we need to have an arts council that is truly connected to the arts, and rather than be an extension of a government bureaucracy. We need an arts council that champions the arts, not just instrumentalizes it for government policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasi. Next, we'd like to invite Damien.
So what have we learned from COVID? I think I agree, Sasi. We need to look after everyone, and we need to relook our economy. I don't think I've enough time to talk about that issue. But to come out of this COVID-19 economic situation and to emerge stronger than before. It's about maintaining a strong economy, and a strong economy needs to be, in this context, needs to be a dynamic economy. I'd love to share a bit more thoughts on that, but I'm aware that I'm on limited time. So I'd just like to refer everyone to a paper that a local economist wrote. His name is Manu Bhaskaran. Manu, if you're watching, hello. This was a paper published with the Lowy Institute, and it's a fantastic paper about how our economy hasn't been dynamic enough and how it needs to be more dynamic moving forward. And then I want to close off with to answer Mr. Yong's question. And this is something that I didn't mention in my opening address just now. I think we need to seriously consider, when we talk about social mobility, abolishing, relooking at the admission criteria. And my preference is for abolishing alumni and affiliation-based enrollment in all schools, and abolishing the GEP and IP, the Gifted Education Program and the Integrated Program, because these two programs, as long as they exist, are going to make the exams or tests in school high stakes for those people who want to compete. And then it's also going to cause the better schools to pull away from the other schools. So I understand that as far as enrollment for primary schools, locality enrollment is going to be difficult. And that is a problem that has to be looked at from the point of view of urban planning. In doing research for this, I mean, I was shocked to find, and I looked at the numbers on data.gov, I was shocked to find that in the whole of Bukit Timah, according to how the boundaries are drawn by the government, there are only 8,300 HDB residents in Bukit Timah. So the primary schools there are obviously going to only accept certain people from a certain background, right? And this is an issue that we have to look at across the entire nation as well, and not just at Bukit Timah. And in closing, I just want to say about our education system that we've done well, but we need to do better, right? Our education system is a national treasure, but it has to be a treasure for all, not just for some. Right now, education is about unlocking the imaginations and dreams of all students. And right now, people might prize the route to the educational route to more higher paying jobs than routes less traveled. And as long as the market pays people with certain types of qualifications better than those who don't have those types of qualifications, that problem is going to persist. And so to change that, we can't just change the education system, we need to look at how our economy is structured as well. And that will take time, but the education system provides us with a good starting point to do this, because even if the rest of society is going to be slow to react, you can always rely on the stubbornness, the idealism, and the passion of young people to break barriers and to push boundaries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damien, for sharing that. Thierry, would you like to share your closing thoughts and answers to the two questions? Thank you.
Yeah, I think in terms of takeaways or learning points post-COVID or even from COVID, I think policy-wise, the importance of resilience has come up a lot. And personally, resilience looks like, like what Sasi said, rethinking market economics and what is essential. And for me, that ties in very well with building a green and socially equitable transition as a principle to future-proof, our economy and society. And also about Damien's point earlier about education and climate change isn't just a science. Such crises, even like this pandemic, is increasingly and it's incredibly intersectional. And we need all causes and all disciplines to recognize their role in the pandemic, in climate change, and in pushing for climate action. And we also need more humanities-driven or intersectional climate research as well. And echoing Sasi's point on distributive justice, I think something that has come up is a lot of autonomous community support. And I think to some extent, it has taught us to remove ourselves from individualistic mindsets and interests to, looking after the community and looking after the people around us and for those who might be worse off in dealing with this crisis. And it's something that I hope continues. And I think the last point about youth activism or youth just generally becoming more socially aware, I think it's increasing and we definitely need more voices to be speaking up. And I think this requires a lot of courage because there are a lot of risks involved, like what Bauji said, at home or even, in their careers in the future, or sometimes some people just do not feel safe speaking up, or do not have the luxury of time and capacity to do enough research to speak up. But fundamentally, I think people care and they want to be listened to. So here's a call to say that, there are many voices, youth voices speaking with you, and the word activism shouldn't be a word that is shunned, but the fundamental principle of it is to speak up and show up for issues that you care about and engage with not just your politicians, but even your community, social circles, to reimagine what a post-COVID Singapore can look like. And I hope that this youth awareness and sense for social justice is continued after this.
Thank you, Kiran. Bauji, over to you. Unmute yourself, please, Bauji. Unmute yourself.
If there is one single takeaway for me as a result of this crisis, and that takeaway is that this narrative that the PAP government is always right, it never goes wrong, it can anticipate all the problems in the world. Obviously, it didn't do it, right? That's very clear. I mean, I think they themselves will admit it. So, first point. Second point is, I think moving out of COVID, I see two major issues coming to the forefront. One is international relations. As the world begins to relook globalization, they now look at themselves or at their neighbors. These are the people I want to work with, I want to trade with. And for Singapore, there's going to be a major, major problem. And I feel that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will be very, very important. It is not that it was not important many years ago under ministers like Rajaratnam, for example, and we had some of the best diplomats with us, Tommy Koh, S.R. Nathan, and the likes. I'm not convinced that we have diplomats at that level. And my if I can call it a wish, is that we need those diplomats. The second point is, for want of a better word, talent. I am more and more convinced that we have, or the government has, missed the ball or dropped the ball on the talent issue, not developing our people fast enough, much earlier, leaving it to a much later stage, so much so that now we have to depend on foreigners. I'm not an anti-foreigner by any means. I'm not an anti-talent person. If we have the right talent, we should take them in. And to add to that, the economy is going to demand the type of people, the type of jobs that they are creating are going to be very, very different. I'm not convinced that we have enough people, Singaporeans, who can do all those jobs, right? So I hope that these two issues, and I'm sure the government is looking into it, but the bigger issue is talent. How is the government going to convince the public that we need foreign talent? It again dropped the ball many years ago when it lifted the floodgates to allow so many people in and cause a lot of problems, and also making sure that we take in the right people. Yep, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bauji. Thank you. A big thanks to all our panelists who joined us today, and they're sharing, I would say, across the generations. And it's the first time that in our Youth Wing webinars that we're trying this panelists asking each other questions, and personally I find it very exciting. Thank you very much to the panelists again for sharing your experience and your view. And we have come to the end of our webinar today. Thank you everyone for signing up for the webinar on Zoom, and also for the many who are watching it on our Facebook Live. Thank you very much. And I would like to apologize to those on Facebook, because I understand there was some technical glitch with the Facebook site, and we couldn't start on time on the Facebook page. So I do apologize for that. So once again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you once again to our panelists for sharing with us their views and experience. And hope all of us can come together for the next webinar again in the near future. So I wish you all a good afternoon and a good weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.